Great, thanks so much for the introduction. Somehow, usually presentations don't work, and I think it's funny because everyone talks about AI nowadays and how humans will replace us, but then usually simple things like video calls don't work, so I think we are still far away, and that's also sort of like the topic of my talk, if it then will finally load. But basically, maybe just as a quick introduction for me to understand who's in the audience, how many of you are devs or engineers? Can you just raise your hands? Okay, how many of you are designers? Okay, how many of you are biz people? And any others? What are you doing? Okay, that's cool. You were others as well? No, okay. Cool, so basically I'm going to talk about what's still needed to actually build better bots, and I'm totally with Matty that design is a very important part of it, but also something we learned while building our own bots is basically that there's still like a technology challenge, and it's basically killing the monster Matty described in the last question, which is like taking care of all these text and basically text elements and dialogues you get. So let's get started with this. This was like the tech world in April, so 6 months ago, right after F8. So everyone was super crazy. We saw that we organized this meetup in Berlin, and like the signups just went crazy, and we had double as many people on the event. Everyone was talking about bots and thought by now, 6 months later, everything will be a bot, right? Actually, if we really look to like now, it looks more like this. People are crying, especially if they have really bad retention on their bots. They spend a lot of time like designing the conversational flow, but then nobody really uses it after the first time. And that's a big problem we see, and also something we encountered ourselves. So what happened? Can you just, yeah, cool. So when I think about bots, I don't see it that much just as a new channel, but I really see it also as a way for, how I call it, like non-experts using expert software. And to give you one example of this, let's think of you're a CEO of a company and you would have like a dashboard of like lots of different metrics, what happens in your big corporation. The question for you, I mean, why you would visit this is always like, what's going on in my business? You know, is it doing well? And that's something that you can actually, with a bot, solve as a challenge, because you can just ask the same question but get a different answer based on who you are in the company, but also you don't need to figure out like which chart really is the main thing for you here. And I think that's not only true for this example, because that's obviously pretty high level and sort of corporate, but it's also true for my dad. So my dad, he's not an expert in using like websites because he just didn't grow up with that. So for him, using something like Kayak or Skyscanner is actually expert software. So he's a non-expert. But with a bot, he could actually use that and just have a normal conversation as he has with his son, for example. So that's the big promise. That's also why Nadala keeps on saying that bots are the new apps. And we actually set out to build something like that, similar to what I just showed you, called DataBot. And it allowed you to naturally talk to your SQL database. So if you're an app developer for mobile apps, you usually have like a big data warehouse on something like Amazon Redshift, and there's a big threshold for people to get data out of that. So if you just have a simple question like, how many people signed up last week for my app, that's quite hard to get and actually not really possible to discuss in Slack. And there are other tools out there like StatsBot who do that for Google Analytics, and we basically did that like on raw SQL. The problem is, so what we found while building this is that not everyone is a developer out there. So I, as a developer, I wish that people specify everything really, really well, right? They would say something like, how many new users did we have last week in Austria on Android that bought at least one item? So that's great, because I can pass it, I can send it to wit.ai, and then get back all the entities and just do the SQL query. Awesome. Problem is, that's what people put, even like some misspellings. They would just say user. And that's something that happens a lot if you think about like hotlines. If people call companies, they just get like some phrase, and then the other guy on the other end needs to figure out what needs to happen. And that's really the big problem in all of this. So when we built this, we actually saw two main limitations to the current technology stack. And the first one is that the user still needs to learn how to use the bot. So even if it's cool to put in like natural language commands, you still need to know which command you can put in. And that's really not the promise that everyone is excited about. So in this case, you need to say like drill down new users last month by country. And obviously you can have variations. You can say segment or something else and not drill down, but that's not really cool. And the second limitation is that the bot actually doesn't remember. So if you want to have a question that is related to something you've said before, it's really not doable easily. So in this case, I just want to know, like, you know, how does that compare to the other month? And then the bot will say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know. And it's really something we reached as a point in our development cycle with DataBot, and something we see a lot in the market right now. So all about statefulness. That's sort of like the techie word for this, because you want to know what's the state of the conversation, and then based on that, make the right decision on what's the next step the bot should actually do with you as a user. So how can you overcome this? Matty mentioned it. If you're not Google, pick a narrow domain. I 100% agree on that, and I think that's a good strategy. Definitely works better than just doing everything. But then what Slack and also Facebook Messenger introduced in the last months are really UI elements. So you can actually say, as opposed to just giving them all of the options in the world, you basically guide them through. I'm sure you guys use bots like that. That usually feels more like a form, and it's not really a great conversation and not a cool experience. And then you can go and just make like the biggest decision tree in the world that is really hard to maintain, and really just not is the way forward, we think. So what should you do? Or like what's sort of like, how does a cool bot look like? Or what do we think it should be? I think really first off, and it's most important, and it's something we're currently working on, it should be able to handle context and any user input. And what I mean with that is really, you can ask questions related to something so it keeps track of the state of the conversation, but not like in a hard-coded way, but programmatically. The second thing, and that's sort of more in the future, is really personalization. And that's going back to this example I gave earlier with like the CEO asking the question, how's my business going? He might get a different answer than the CFO or the chief marketing officer. And that's really important, we think. And bots are actually a great platform to do that because everyone potentially has a different user interface. And the third thing, and we see this with, I think, Matti as well, with Mikan already, is that bots are used in collaboration as like really the bot coworker. But I think where this will lead to is somehow that a bot is empathy listening to what's happening in a conversation. So in this case here, I'm writing with somebody on Slack, and we really don't get the point of like coming to any conclusion. So Mikan bot, or meeting bot in this case here, will just jump in and suggest to jump on a call. And I think that's really where humans can be helped with when they are stuck. But this is, for us at least, more the future. I'm not sure if anyone is working on this. If you do, please let me know, because I'm really interested in that. But you are working on this, we should actually talk anyway. We already talked. Cool, but that's really cool, we think. So how do we build that? That's obviously the question here. There are a lot of developers in this room. So let's jump to this really quickly. So these are like sort of like the core pieces of a bot. You can put it in different ways, but that's sort of, I think, somehow agreed on. So you have like somehow a messaging interface or chat interface, and then there's a natural language parser, which is usually wit.ai, what a lot of people use. And then the conversation engine, and then you have some response. And then you usually have like some API calls to some backends. Okay, looks quite simple. It is actually not that simple, especially this part. And this is really where the magic happens. And that's where currently a lot of if and else statements are actually used. So if you look at how you can build something like this, there are two extremes to this. So you can either do it like handcrafted, and this is usually like rule-based. You have lots of flowcharts, end up having lots of if and else statements. And the good thing is that you actually get the responses you want. The problem is, if you ever build something like this, it's quite hard to maintain. And I think Matti just mentioned that as well. So you end up just having a bunch of really big decision trees that you need to maintain over time. And then on the other extreme, there are some really interesting examples coming out of research that do that totally based on machine learning. So you basically just feed them sample conversations in, and then they will have some conversation, but it's not really clear what's the meaning of this, right? So you can't put like a business logic or something like that behind. And that's really the problem with this approach. So as you can see, it gets quite far. So what do you think about Messi? He's a good player. So it already recognized that it's like about a football player, so that's quite cool. But still, you don't have a business logic behind that. So what's actually needed is like somehow something in the middle, like a combination of both of this. And that's exactly what we're working on. So we're working on a deep learning framework for developers so that they can use like more clever bots using supervised learning and reinforcement learning. And this will basically allow you to scale bots much better based on sample conversations, but also putting business logic behind that. And then improve the bot with reinforcement learning over time. And because we are not so focused like on the whole framework, We're just doing this dialogue piece that I showed you earlier. It also works pretty much on every platform. And that's what we do. And if you guys are interested in that, obviously let me know. And if you have any feedback, also, I think we have much more time for questions, right? Awesome, great, excited.
Awesome, you can keep it. So a great round of applause, first of all, for the great insight on from your side. And I think it's what's really interesting, and that's a great thing about the masterclass, that you can actually, there's some connections to the speaker before, and it's great that like you're having similar learnings on the one hand, but also you can learn from each other. And that's why we're having a Q&A here as well, because the questions maybe, or the question you're asking yourself right now, someone else has the same question, but maybe doesn't want to speak up. So we still have time now for the Q&A. So are there any questions for this gentleman on my right? Any question marks? Everything clear? Oh, actually 2 questions right away, please.
You said you're doing deep learning and reinforcement learning. So what kind of feature set do you apply some pre-processing techniques? Do you just feed the words? Do you use like RNNs, LSTMs, or how are you doing that?
Yeah, we actually use LSTMs. And it depends a bit on the use case. That's also why we currently work more like together with big clients, depending on whatever they need, right? But we can do like sample conversations, label them, and then start with that. And then there is like some connection to whatever API you're using. You know, you always need to do like some backend stuff, because otherwise you end up just having normal random conversation, which doesn't really bring you anywhere. So that depends on the setup. But then also what we did is, if there is like no sample conversation at all, we usually use like some Amazon Mechanical Turk or things like that to just create human-to-human conversations, which we then can use. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, I think that was a yes. Satisfied. Another question, please.
It's not actually a question. I was wondering if you have enough time to do us a demo, because it's a conversation engine. Right?
Sorry?
Yes.
It's like a conversation engine. No?
Yeah, it's a conversation engine.
If you have enough time, you could do a demo for us?
Yeah, we still have 5 minutes. Could you do a demo?
Yeah, a demo. Yeah, sure. I hope it works.
Oh,
actually.
he heard the word demo and then he went on fire. That's great.
No, my problem was that my computer was freeze, so that's why I skipped the demo.
But we still have, we're going to start with the final presentation of Lemmings in 10 minutes. So we still have 5 minutes for.
Here it is. Okay, on the other screen. Awesome. So, I mean, just one word to this demo. It's really a demo. Because, no, I mean, no, the thing is that we currently work with big companies and basically build bots for them. So I can't show anything of that. But we obviously get this question a lot. So we built like this funny little recipe bot, and I hope it behaves.
Would you prefer a headset?
No, it's all right.
Okay.
I think. Cool. Okay, so that basically is exactly what we did with this guy here, because there is no data out there where people talk about recipes in like a way that it's a recipe assistant. So we used Mechanical Turk to just generate some conversations and then just trained it a bit on other stuff. So let's just see if everything is up here. What a great example. I think I talked too much to him before. Cool. So let's say I want to cook pad thai.
Do you want me to hold your mic?
Oh, it's all right. No.
Oh, you're multitasking.
Yeah,
I like
I'm
that.
multitasking. So, and in this case, it basically just gives like one suggestion, because we haven't really implemented that particular action that you would get suggestions on, like, is it Italian or French or whatever you like. So it just picks one. But what's cool now is that it actually knows that we talked about this thing here. So you can say something like, is that easy to cook? Okay, maybe not. That's always the problem with live demos. We can see he's a bit of shaky at the moment. Let's say something like, does it contain nuts? Cool. So the recipe has nuts in it. So it's basically, it knows that it has been talking about this before. And if we would have more time, we would make this demo more impressive. It's just a matter of resources for us right now. But it's all based on LSTMs, and I think that's the exciting part of it. So there are no if and else statements behind this. And if you're interested, I can show you guys some more stuff later. Also like about the actual architecture.
It's based on what?
LSTMs, long short-term memory. It's like a deep learning technology.
There was a question in the back.
Yeah. So in this case, we actually use like a recipe API. I forgot the name. I think Spoonacula or something. We know these guys, and so we basically do an API call based on whatever you want then. That's something we used Mechanical Turk for. So we had like some people talking to other people about recipes, and then we used that to feed it into the system.
What's the output the LSTM generates for you? So
It's
does it extract, like, I want to cook pad thai, does it extract a pad thai?
no. It basically creates a vector of like what's the next most likely action. And in this, and that's also why I said like we are between. If we go back to this other thing here, so that's why I said we are in between both, because you need to somehow obviously define what actions the bot can take, but then on the other hand, the bot has a statistical model behind it to figure out what's the next action to take. So, and that could be like an API call, like in this case, calling an API to get some recipe with that information. Based on what you had in the parser. So we actually also built the parser ourselves. We used wit.ai before, but that wasn't really reliable. It was just too slow with all the API calls back and forth. So we use an open source library called Meaty from MIT, which works really well. If you're interested in that, I can also talk more about this. But that works quite well in the combination. Yeah? Yes, we do. So that was this piece I just mentioned. So if we go to like these basic building blocks, so that's where most people just do a lot of if and else statements right now. They figure out like some way how to build a flowchart, right? And then they would get the data from wit.ai or api.ai. And this is also something where we build our own thing based on Meaty. That's a library from MIT.
Great. Okay, we had already a couple of questions, some question marks solved. We have time for one last question. Is there still something on your mind or everything cleared? You mentioned that you're going to be around. You can answer some more questions, but I'm going to take your question as...
What kind of data did you use to train your deep learning?
So it's a combination of both, really. So you have a conversational trainer data set, which I just mentioned. We use like Amazon Mechanical Turk to create the conversations, and then we label them, and based on like what actions people wanted to perform, right? So that's a combination of this other approach I just showed. And then on the other hand, there is this API, and what we also do, we generalize from that. So which means if you have a training conversation with somebody saying, I want Italian food, then this is enough. We don't need another one that says, I want Spanish food, because we basically look into the database and generalize from that example that this is a cuisine type. So you actually need less conversational data, but it's a combination of both. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for joining us, CEO from LastMile, for the ones who just joined. Thanks for giving us an insight in what you're doing and in where this is heading.